Welcome to Courage and Faith. I'm glad you're here. This is a place for honest conversations about what it means to stand strong in a culture that's constantly changing. We're not here to stir fear or to add to the noise. We're here to bring clarity, courage, and truth that's rooted in God's Word. This podcast exists to strengthen your faith, sharpen your convictions, and remind you of this simple truth. You are not alone, and you were never meant to live afraid. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to the Courage and Faith podcast. We are here at Courage Conference 2026. We have the one and only Tim Barton with us. Tim, welcome to Courage Conference. Welcome to Akron, Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're so excited to have you at Courage Conference. Would you just tell the audience a little bit, about yourself, about your story, about Wall Builders, all of it?
Yeah, so my name is Tim Barton. I am the president of Wall Builders. Wall Builders is a name taken from the Bible story of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah obviously saw the destruction of Jerusalem, wants to go back and rebuild the walls. And in Nehemiah 2:17, he has an invitation to people to join him. He says, "Come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be a reproach." Some translations say a disgrace. And back in the 1980s, my dad was really convicted and felt the call kind of Nehemiah, looking at America, even back then, saying there's a lot of immorality happening, things we need to do. And so he got involved trying to help restore some of the biblical, religious, moral, constitutional foundation of the nation. Today, we focus mostly on American history, helping reteach American history so that we understand where we came from, so we can try to rebuild what's been torn down. It's almost like if Nehemiah would have taken a picture and been like, guys, here's what we're trying to, this is the picture, right? This is what the wall looked like. Let's rebuild this thing. So we focus mostly on American history. We have the largest private collection of original documents from the founding era. We have handwritten documents from every signer of the Declaration, every signer of the Constitution. We have almost 100,000 documents in the collection. So it's phenomenal. We use original documents to tell the story. So we're not saying, hey, take my word for it. Like, I have a PhD, I'm really smart. Take my word for it. Instead, we say, no, the authority is, this is the actual letter, and this is what he actually wrote. So we try to point people back to the authority of the source, trusting the history of the guys who were there. So mostly that's kind of who we are and what we do. That's
awesome. So, growing up, you probably were immersed in this from the time you were
very much
a kid. So can you talk a little bit about that, though? I'd love to hear.
So when I was 6 years old, my dad really kind of kicked it off. When we started traveling full time, we had a 15-passenger van. I have two siblings. And so we joke when people say, "So you're homeschooled?" And we say, "No, we were van schooled," because we were in a van. Yeah. We would travel for most of the year. My dad would go to different events and conferences and churches and speak. There was one year we were gone for almost 11 months that year, just on the road traveling. But the positives, by the time I was 11, I'd been to all 50 states. And the only reason it even took that long was Alaska and Hawaii. It took us a little while to get there. So I've seen all of America. My wife was born in Germany, and she loves Europe and wants to travel. And I'm always like, no, America's amazing. We should tour more of America. I think most Americans, we see imagery from places around the world, and we go, man, we want to travel there. And not that I'm against travel, but I think we undersell sometimes the beauty of what God put in this country and how incredible it is. So I had the privilege of growing up and seeing the nation, and certainly traveling with my family, hearing my dad talk about history all the time. But when I went to college, I was playing some sports. I got out, I got involved in some ministry. I was on staff at a church. I was a high school teacher and coach. And my passion was apologetics. I love defending or helping people understand the reliability, the truth, the accuracy of God's word and why we should apply it to our life. But ultimately, in my mind, it was like, I'm just defending truth. I'm trying to help people know what truth is. And so it was an easy application for me of recognizing that the devil is not just attacking the truth of the validity of Scripture. He's attacking the reality of biology, right? You can go down the list. Well, he's attacking also the reality of what God has done in this nation, of how this nation was built on biblical foundations. And so for me, it's taking the love I already had of defending the truth of who God is and what God has done. And it was moving it from the reality of what God's word is to the reality of what God has done in this nation, which is rich, incredible, and deep. And so it's kind of a little bit of the transition path from growing up in a 15-passenger van to being a teacher and a coach and on staff at a church to now leading our organization.
That's amazing. And it's cool probably now for you to look back and see how that sort of all wove together to bring you to where you are now. I don't know if you're taking your kids around a 15-passenger van when you travel, but that's so cool that you guys were able to do that all together growing up.
Yeah.
I love hearing you speak. I love learning about history. We were just talking with Pastor Steve and Martin about how important that is and how he's noticing within his congregation that a lot of people are waking up to realizing they were taught a revisionist history, essentially, that they don't know as much about history as but they want to now know. And so you guys have got a lot of fantastic like resources and courses, all the things to help teach people what that is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that we try to do, when my dad started, it was his initial idea and we just embraced it, was as he was rediscovering this true history, it was fascinating to him. And so the stories that he was the most entertained by, he tried to tell those stories thinking, well, probably other people would be entertained by these stories as well. So we try to be storytellers. I mean, almost like, you can go back and read the book of Acts in the Bible, whether it's Peter or Stephen. A lot of times when you look at some of these amazing sermons, they're actually giving history lessons of who God is, of what God's done, of how that applies today. And so we try to be storytellers. And so we have a lot of books and resources, all going back to original documentation. So we'll tell the story of whether it be George Washington or John Adams or John Hancock, whoever it is, and we will fill the story with quotes from their writings and their letters, so that as we're telling the story, we're showing like, this is what he actually said in these moments and events. Again, so the authority is not on who's telling the story. It's that, no, this is his writing. This is what he's saying about the story. And so we have lots of books. We are also all over social media. We try to put out videos every week telling some of these stories. And there are courses for whether it be a church that wants to do, some kind of small group, Sunday school class, if it's homeschool families, whatever it might be, even Christian schools. There's actually some public school teachers that use our stuff in their classroom too. Good for them. But we try to have things that are easily accessible history, that it doesn't feel academic when you read it. It feels like you're reading a good story, because that's really what it is. You read the Bible and you're like, there's amazing stories here. Right. Some of the best stories are actually from the Bible, because when God's part of it, it just gets more interesting. And that's exactly what happened in this nation. Yeah.
No, you guys are great storytellers. I think that's part of the reason why people are drawn to hearing you speak and taking in your stuff, because it can be sort of like I wouldn't fancy myself a history buff. Like, I wouldn't go and look for original documentation and be, but when someone brings it to life in the way that you guys do, and I'm sure for a lot of people listening maybe feel the same way, it's fascinating and I love learning about it. It's just like someone else telling it to me, and the way that you do is so helpful, and especially from a Christian perspective, because you bring and you show how God is in all of it. So it's really cool. What are you going to be talking about at Courage Conference?
So I have two sessions. The first one, I'm going to talk about the courageous church. Had it not been for the influence of churches and pastors, there never would have been in America. We would still be a British colony, or something else might have happened in the story, right? But I'm going to talk first about a courageous church and document that when you go through the American Revolution, some of the most noted leaders were actually pastors. Some of the most noted events or the Battle of Lexington and Concord, it literally was church congregations showing up to oppose the British that were marching into their town. It was local churches taking care of local problems in so many ways. So I'm going to get into a courageous church and show that connection. And then in the second session, I'm going to talk about the Great Awakenings, but having the courage to make a revival and awakening, because we've had a lot of revivals in American history, a lot. Really, in God's faithfulness, every 20 or 30 or 40 years, there's another outpouring of His Spirit in the nation. It's amazing. God is so good to this nation. But most of those times, they've been revivals, and revivals are personalized and internalized. The awakenings, people took what God was doing and applied it to culture. And when you apply anything biblically to culture, there's a lot of opposition. And so the first Great Awakening, for example, George Whitefield, he was rejected from more churches than he was invited to. He was opposed all the time, but he had the courage to push through the confrontation, through the challenge, and continue to boldly stand for God's word. And so what I'm going to connect is that we are historically, we can show we're in a revival. God is moving right now. Young men attending church, coming to the faith, Bible sales at an all-time high, college campuses, revivals, baptism. Like it's amazing to see God on the move. So the question is, will this be another revival or an awakening? Well, to make it an awakening, historically, here's what happened in the first second great awakening. So I'm going to walk through that. And so at a Courage conference, we're talking about it takes courage to do that. It took a lot of courage for George Whitefield, for Charles Finney, for these leaders to do the things they did, because when you stand boldly for God's word, there's going to be opposition even in revivals. There's going to be people saying, well, you should, hey, don't say that. Don't do it that way. You're going to offend people. You have to have the courage to boldly stand for what God's word actually says and apply it to life and culture. And if we do that, we can make a revival and awakening. So that's what I'm going to encourage and challenge: a courageous church and then courageous Christians to make a revival and awakening.
That's amazing. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for coming out to Courage Conference. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Oh man, it is so good to be with you guys. Thank you. Please have a seat. It is my honor to be here. My name is Tim Barton. I'm the president of Wall Builders. Being in Texas, there's some confusion of the name Wall Builders. We don't have anything to do with the southern border, although I support it. It comes from the Bible story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the one who saw the nation that he loved had been destroyed. The walls had been torn down, and he led the movement to go back and rebuild what had been destroyed 40 years ago. That's the call that my dad felt for our organization. He wanted to help restore the religious, the moral, the constitutional foundation of the nation. And for 40 years, we've been trying to tell people the story of America. I will say it's probably more important today than it ever has been, because the rising generation is being told a lie about who we are and where we came from. Right now, students can tell you more bad things about America than good things about America. And it's utterly ridiculous that as we have this summer come to the place that we are celebrating 250 years, and can I get some slides behind me? There it is. As we celebrate 250 years as a nation, this was something that should have been a unifying moment. But there were Marxist progressives, whatever other labels we want to give them, that used a moment instead of going, wait a second, can we just be honest for a second? Over 250 years, there's been nowhere where there's more stability, freedom, prosperity, or benevolence than America. We should celebrate that. Instead, this was a moment to be divisive, and this is certainly, if you are a person spiritually attuned, you can just know that it is the devil, the one that came to bring division, to divide and separate in these ways. And I say this specifically and intentionally because if we just knew some of the basic story, the lies that we are being told, we would know instantly, well, that's not correct at all. So for example, there was a group of professors who, looking at America, recognized America is actually really special. When for them, they were looking at the constitutional foundation, they said, we've enjoyed more stability than any other nation. Our constitution has lasted longer than anybody else's. They said, well, let's just see what that looks like. And so they asked the question, what is the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And if you want to look up this entire study, it was done by the University of Chicago, by the law school there. It was actually done in the last couple of years. You can go on their website. You can read the whole thing. It's very detailed. But what they determined was, in the thousands of years of recorded human history they were able to investigate, the average length of a constitution in world history is only 17 to 19 years. That's how long normal constitutions last. Now, every September 17th in America, our U.S. Constitution has another birthday. This September 17th, our U.S. Constitution is 239 years old. We are the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world, and it's not even close. You know that France, they went through a revolution. After our American Revolution, they've had 15 constitutions, and they're considered a stable nation. Today, anyway. We'll see how long that lasts. But this is the reality. We don't recognize how special this nation is because we're so ignorant of historic context or even the way the rest of the world operates. In fact, there was a professor from the University of Houston who also wanted to know what has brought the Constitution or America so much stability. So he asked the question, and this was a study done from the University of Houston, is where do the founding fathers come up with their ideas? And what he discovered And actually, by the way of background, what he determined to do was go back and review the writings of the founding fathers. His thought was, if we study and read their writings, and if we find the people they quote, if we can track those back to the original sources, then we'll see the sources that influence the founding fathers the most. This was his idea. And the reason behind it is if we know what influenced the founding fathers the most, we know where they got their ideas for the Constitution, and then we know what's made the Constitution the most successful governing document in the history of the world. This was his initiative and project. Now, early on, he said, we're going to start from like before the Stamp Act. We're going to go after the Bill of Rights, and we're going to review an estimated 15,000 documents, which, by the way, is what he did. He then broke it down and said, if you look at all of these were all documents important at the time, but there's actually about 1,000 that were the most significant political writings of the day. The word political is very important. These were the political writings of the day. From that roughly 1,000 documents, they found 3,154 quotes. And they're going to track these all back to the original source. Now, it's worth noting at this point, this was a study done in the 1970s and 1980s. The reason it's important to know is because that's before the internet was a thing. And some people in the room have no concept what that was like. Allow me to help you. It used to be if you were like reading and like George Washington written a letter and you're reading it and you're like, hey, there's like quotation marks. Well, I wonder who he's quoting. You couldn't just like ask your chat GPT to help you out. You actually had to go to the library. Now, this professor had grad students. He had help. What they did is went to the library and they went to the end of a row. He said, okay, everybody get a book, start reading and let me know when you find the quote. 3,154 quotes they had to look up. It took them 20 years to do the project. Okay, now, again, like ChatGPT, Grok would have done this in maybe a day. Okay, way better now, but this is still considered the most historically accurate data ever done on this topic. And he released his findings in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. So you actually can get online and read this book today. It's no longer being produced, but you can find copies online or you can maybe even find it on Google Books. But the point is, in this book, he actually documented what the greatest influences of the founding fathers were. And he said the number one cited individual in the founders' writings was a guy named Charles Montesquieu. Charles Montesquieu did the Spirit of the Laws. A lot of important thoughts come from Charles Montesquieu, some of the separation of powers ideas. He was a big deal in the founding era. The second most cited individual was a guy named William Blackstone. He did the commentaries on the laws of England. And those were the commentaries that were basic foundational things for any of the legal framework we did in America. The third most cited individual was John Locke. He did the two treatises of government. He was the most quoted at the beginning of the American Revolution because he's the one that popularized life, liberty, and property that Jefferson made life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He was the most quoted then, but after we start the revolution, he wasn't quoted very much after that. But those are the top three most cited individuals. But what this Professor Donald Lutz pointed out is that those are the most cited individuals, but not the most cited source. The most cited source in the founders' writings was the Bible, with 34% of all the quotes they found in the writings coming from the Bible. Now, remember what he was trying to discover is what was the greatest influence on the founding fathers that helped give us the most stable governing document in the history of the world. It's even more interesting when he began talking about, because this was an academic study that have clearly defined parameters, and so they're only looking up what's in quotation marks. He said, but when we were reading these writings, we saw so many obvious references to scripture that had we included all of the Bible references not in quotation marks, the number would have been way higher than 34%. I can tell you as someone that reads founders' writings every day, almost exclusively, the majority of the time when the founding fathers quote the Bible, they don't put it in quotation marks. The majority of the time. I would argue you have to at least double that number from their writings. And this is why I want to point this out. It's a big deal because people look at the founding fathers today and we often think, well, they weren't religious, right? They were deists. They wanted a separation of church and state. There's a lot of narratives that we hear and believe today, and we only believe them because we've never taken time to study and do the research that when honest professors have done that, they said, oh no, it's very clear. The Bible was the most influential thing. And actually, let me go one further. Because not only was the Bible the most influential source, there was another professor, her name was Alice Baldwin. She actually started the women's program at Duke University. She was there in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. But in 1928, she was already a professor. She wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And in this book, she was contending that it was the early founding pastors that were the most influential in what happened in America becoming a nation. Now, she makes a lot of interesting and bold claims, which, by the way, I totally support and agree with. But the reason I bring this up is in her conclusion, when she wraps it all together, the book is about 170 pages. Her conclusion is 5 pages. You can go online to Google Books or somewhere else. You actually can read it online. And even if you just read the 5-page conclusion, I would highly recommend it. It's fascinating what she points out. Because one of the things she says is that when you look at the Declaration, she says there's not a right, and this is the quote from her conclusion, there is not a right asserted in the Declaration of Independence which had not been first preached from American pulpits prior to 1763. Now, what she's saying is that every single big issue in the Declaration didn't come from the founding fathers. She actually goes on to point out the founding fathers didn't come up with a single unique idea. Instead, they repeated what they'd been learning from their pastors for decades leading up into that moment. Now, again, this would be something that today we'd be like, I'm not sure about all that because it's counter narrative to what we've heard. But here's what's great about her book. At the end of her 5-page conclusion, she has the beginning of her appendix section. Appendix A is a listing where she says, here's some examples where some of these rights and grievances appeared. And she puts the name of the pastor and the paragraph from his sermon in the appendix. She literally puts the receipts in the appendix. So she's like, guys, don't take my word for it. This is literally what the pastors were dealing with. And by the way, even if you're not like a history nerd or someone that really dives into and loves this story, even if you just know general big picture history, this shouldn't be that surprising if you know big picture history. Because big picture, what is the most significant thing, historically speaking, the most significant thing that happens in America, it's a period, that happens in America, breadth of time, before the American Revolution? It's called the First Great Awakening. For 30 years, the most significant revival in American history is taking place in America. And if you know that, where you're like, well, then it shouldn't be a surprise that in the midst of this amazing revival, pastors are teaching biblical truth that's impacting the founding fathers. Now, again, the reason I want to point this out is because people look at the founding fathers today and we wildly misconstrue who they were and what they believed because we don't know their stories. And we think, well, they weren't religious. I just want to point out, historically documented, the greatest influence on the founding fathers was the Bible. The most significant voice in the founding era was the pastors. Had it not been for the Bible and the church, there would never have been an America. But let me go even further. Because again, a lot of people look at the founding fathers and they're like, I've never heard this. I'm not sure if I agree with that. Okay, let me walk you through a big picture story. The founding fathers, the very first time they ever meet, September 6, 1774 is in Carpenter's Hall. Not too far away up in Boston, you can go see, Philadelphia. I really do know history, guys, I promise. Not too far away in Philly, you can go see Carpenter's Hall. The founding fathers, when they first started their business, September 6, 1774, the very first motion from the very first meeting was made by Thomas Cushing, and it was a motion that they begin with prayer. There was then a painting done to depict this beginning prayer service the founding fathers had. This is the very famous painting done depicting that opening prayer of Congress. Now, for those of you who have not been to a serious Bible study before, that's what it looks like. That's the posture, right? I mean, we don't have anybody laying on the ground, but like other than that, it's pretty close depending on what denomination you go to, and I'm not getting into that right now. I just want to point out, this is historic record. In fact, John Adams, the week after it, he writes Abigail a letter. He says, Abigail, I've been so busy that I haven't had time to sit down and write you a letter, but I want to tell you about what happened when we first met. He said, when we first met, he said, Mr. Thomas Cushing of Massachusetts made the very first motion, and it's that we should open with prayer. And actually, it was debated for a minute because there were Anglicans and there were Congregationalists, and they didn't like each other at all. And we weren't sure that we could join together in a moment of prayer, but then Sam Adams Adams stood up and he said, as long as we choose someone that fears God and loves his country, that person can lead us in prayer. And so we agreed that we should invite the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché, he's the guy behind the podium. We should invite him to come and lead us in prayer. So we sent word. And the next morning he showed up. So September 7th is when this actually happens. They make the motion September 6th. They invite him. He doesn't show up until the next morning. So that's when this painting is from, September 7th. But John says, Abigail, when he showed up, he opened the Book of Common Prayer and he read a prayer to us. But then after he read the prayers, he broke out in an extemporaneous prayer. And he went on for at least 10 minutes. One of the other founding fathers there, Silas Dean, said it was so moving, that extemporaneous prayer, it was so moving that even the Quakers had tears running down their cheeks. Okay, this is significant. And John says, Abigail, he then led us in this extemporaneous prayer. And then we read from the collect for the day. Now, in the Book of Common Prayer, there were prayers assigned for the day, but then there were also Bible chapters assigned to read that day, like a Bible reading plan. And John says, and we read those for the day. And one of the things they read, he says, Abigail, it was as if God himself had ordained it to be read. And I'm going to show you part of the letter. I'm explaining more of the letter. I would encourage you, go read the whole letter. It is amazing what John says, but here's part of what he tells her. He says, Abigail, I must beg you to read that psalm. Read the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your father. Psalm 35 was one of the Psalms that King David had written when Saul was chasing him. And David cries out to God, says, Lord, I've done nothing. And he seeks my destruction. You rise up, be my shield, my buckler, my strong right arm. And he goes for like 30 verses. And John says, Abigail, you must remember that as we read this Psalm, we had just gotten word that the night before, the British had surrounded Boston Harbor. They had begun cannonading, firing cannons into Boston. And so when we read this, it was as if God himself had ordained this to be read. Now, I just want to point out, this is John Adams literally describing what happens the very first time the founding fathers meet. Because when they meet for the first time, George Washington, Patrick Henry, right? These guys, they had never met John and Sam Adams. They've never met John Hancock. This is literally the first time they're meeting. And when they meet for the very first time, what's the first motion of the meeting? Guys, we should pray. And they bring in a pastor. And by the way, if you read all of the prayers assigned for that day and then add 10 minutes of an extemporaneous prayer, and then if they read all the chapters assigned that day, it's at least an hour and a half or 2 hours to get through all of those prayers and Bible study for the day. Our nation was birthed out of prayer and Bible study. And today we're told, well, you know, the founding fathers weren't really religious. Again, this is what's crazy to me. We know so little of the story. Let me go further, which as a side note, when John says, Abigail, read it to your father, who was her father? Oh, that was the Reverend Smith, the pastor of their home church. Not to digress, lots of pastors involved in the story. Let me keep going. Because when Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride, most people know that he made a famous midnight ride. Right, what most people don't know is why he was making that ride. He wasn't just riding arbitrarily yelling the British are coming. He was riding specifically to Lexington and Concord to warn them that the British were coming to take all of the guns and gunpowder away, but it was even more. There was a British order that had said, we want the bodies of Mr. Hancock and Adams. And by the way, there was one of the British officers who later gave a report about it. And this is where literally we know this because of the report. He said, our business was to seize a quantity of military stores and the bodies of Hancock and Adams. The British appointed governor said, we will pardon anybody that apologizes and recants except John Hancock and Sam Adams. Those two have to die for sure. Okay? So Paul Revere is writing to warn them, guys, you have to get out. The British are coming. Now, he's writing to warn them because they're in Lexington. But this should raise the question, why are they in Lexington? Well, Paul Revere writes to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. The Reverend Jonas Clark is actually staying in the parsonage. He's the pastor of the church at Lexington. Well, why were John Hancock and Sam Adams there? Oh, this is fascinating. What was the profession of John Hancock's father? He was a pastor. John Hancock's grandfather did what? He was a pastor. John Hancock's dad died when he was 7 years old. He went and lived with his grandfather. Where did his grandfather pastor? The church at Lexington Green. he was staying in the parsonage where he had lived as a kid, back at the church where he had grown up. By the way, Jonas Clark was the one that took over after his grandpa died. So literally, he's with his people in his area. Most people know John Hancock had a famous signature, had no idea he's an outspoken Christian. And by the way, side note of the story, when people are like, well, the founding fathers also were these racist, bigoted slaveholders. It's so dishonest the way we do that today in telling that story because, for example, John Hancock, just as a side note, John Hancock, when his grandfather dies, he gets adopted by his uncle. His uncle is a wealthy merchant, does a lot of trade and shipping business. His uncle also had slaves. When his uncle dies, John Hancock is 21 or 22. John Hancock inherits the uncle's business. John Hancock becomes like the wealthiest guy in New England, incredibly wealthy. Well, he inherits slaves. And that's where people are like, well, see, John Hancock had slaves. Hard pause. What did John Hancock do after he inherited the slaves? He freed them. By the way, John Adams, Sam Adams never had slaves. We misrepresent so much of the narrative and the story. I don't want to digress because there's too many other things I want to tell you. But the reality is, the reason that Paul Revere writes to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark is Jonas Clark was known to be the friend and mentor of founding fathers like Hancock and Adams. And there's a logical reason he was. The next morning when the British show up, there's more than 80 men of the church that go out to oppose the British. And the shot heard around the world, right, where we historically think, well, that's Lexington Green. Where was the green at Lexington? That was the grass in the front yard of the church. These were the men of the church who went to defend the guns and gunpowder of the community on the front yard of the church. The revolution wasn't just birthed because of the influence of pastors. It was birthed because Christians stood on the doorsteps of their church and said, you're not taking our stuff from us. Let me go further. Because this didn't just happen at Lexington. Lexington's top right. Top left, you have the battle at Concord Bridge. Okay, the militia at Concord Bridge, where did they come from? Oh, the church of the Reverend William Emerson, that's where the local militia came from there. You can go to the bottom left, the battle on the road back to Boston. You have people like the Reverend Payson Phillips, Reverend Benjamin Balch, who literally led their congregations to go oppose the British because they had heard the British open fire and had killed Americans. When you get to the bottom right, it's the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill, now there's lots of militias convening to oppose the British, right? But the main body that was there came from the church of the Reverend Joseph Willard. He raised 2 full companies at the back of his church with a sign-up sheet. The American Revolution was influenced far more by Christianity than you've been told. And by the way, fact check me on this. You look every bit of this up. We have been told that Christians and Christianity don't have a part in the story, or that we need to remove that part of the story. By the way, that's why we're in trouble today. Because as Christians, too many of us have bought into the lie that we don't have a role in what's going on today. And that's why we see the nonsense that we do. Let me keep going. It used to be in a different era. We had different leaders like the Reverend Jonas Clark. If you look this guy up, there's a moniker by his name. He's called the Fighting Parson. Okay, there's a reason he's called the Fighting Parson, but part of his story is he was helping recruit forces to join the militia in New Jersey, and he was so influential that somebody suggested, you should be the commander of the forces, and he said, I'm not really qualified, I don't know anything military, I shouldn't be the commander, I'll be the chaplain. He became the chaplain of the forces of New Jersey. He preached every Sunday. He's out involved working with the troops. Well, one of his more famous moments was the Battle of Springfield. The Battle of Springfield, the Americans run out of wadding for their guns, and if you're firing a musket weapon, right, especially back in the day, if you don't have paper or some kind of cloth patch, some kind of wadding, you cannot properly fire this musket. And so when they run out of wadding, they're not able to fight back. He grabbed a group of men and said, follow me. They were at the edge of town. He ran to the local church. He went inside the church and grabbed a stack full of hymn books. They were Isaac Watts hymn books. He ran to the front step. He held up one of the hymn books. His famous line was, give them Watts, boys. Let's put a Watts into them. And they began handing out the hymn book. It's worth noting, the British began to recognize that the main instigators stirring up this opposition were pastors. And in fact, there was a history book written by a loyalist at the end of the Revolution where he said, had it not been for that black-robed regiment, there never would have been a revolution. The Black Robe Regiment is because back then, all pastors wore black clerical robes. And so without these pastors, pastors leading the way, there never would have been a revolution. Well, that's fascinating, but let me tell the rest of Caldwell's story. So the British knew that he was a problem, and they actually sent a detachment to his house. He was gone, but his wife and 2 youngest kids were there. They opened fire on the house. They killed his wife, and with her body inside and 2 kids by her, they set fire to the house. A neighbor came over, dragged her body out, rescued. It was like a 2.5-year-old and a several-week-old. Rescued the babies. James Caldwell comes back in time to find his house burned to the ground. His wife's been murdered, and the body and the baby is rescued after they set fire to it. From this moment forward, he began carrying 2 pistols with him in his waistband everywhere he went. What was amazing is not just that he was able to persevere in the midst of being targeted and singled out for standing for something, but when he would go up to preach, he would open his Bible. He would then draw a pistol, set it on one side of his Bible. He drew a second pistol, set it on the other side of his Bible. He looked at the congregation, said, "The British will not stop me from preaching, but they are welcome to try." That's the kind of pastors that were mentoring the founding fathers to do the things that birthed America. The reason, again, this matters, it literally was the influence of Christianity, of the Bible, of pastors of the church. Let me give you one last example, probably my favorite example. The Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, he was someone who not only was a pastor, his father was the founder of the Lutheran Church in America. He was a pastor, but he also was a member of the state legislature, which met in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now, when people think that pastors and politics shouldn't get involved, let me already clarify, you've confused how this nation began. Because literally pastors were involved from the beginning, but he was not only a pastor, he's a member of the state legislature. They began having a discussion that George Washington, January 1776, has already said we need more troops, we need to raise militias. And they said, well, who is gonna be influential enough that people are gonna wanna follow? The state legislature's having this conversation. And they said, well, I think he could do it. And they point to the pastor, John Peter Muhlenberg. They said, okay, we're giving you a military commission. We want you to go back and raise a troop. So he gets on horseback. From Williamsburg, he rides over 200 miles back to his home church in Woodstock, Virginia. He gets there in time for Sunday service. And his church had an elevated pulpit in the middle because there's no sound system. And he gets up in the pulpit in time to deliver the Sunday service. He opens his Bible and begins reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. A time and a season of purpose for everything under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, gets to verse 8, a time for war and a time for peace. He closed his Bible and he said, there's been a call that we raise an army from this area. And I want to tell you, we're no longer in a time of peace, we're in a time of war. He starts recounting some of what's been going on, why they have to get involved. He says, so we're going to war and I want you to join me. He then bows and closes in prayer. And you can imagine the somber nature in the room when you're like, are we really going to war? At the end of the prayer, he did something that they had never seen before. He stood in the pulpit and began to disrobe. And as he disrobed, he revealed he was wearing the uniform of a Continental Army officer. And he stood in the pulpit and just let him take it in for a second. He then dismounts the pulpit and begins walking down the narrow aisle. And he says, brethren, we came to these lands to enjoy freedom. But if we don't get involved today, we will lose everything we came here to enjoy. I'm going to fight to defend freedom and I want you to come with me. They had a sign-up sheet at the back of the church, a little drummer boy banging on the drum. Over 300 men got signed up that day from his church. But here's my favorite part of the story. There weren't 300 men there that day. How do you get 300 men signed up when they weren't there? Well, the fun part of the story is there were kids that signed their dad up and there were wives that signed their husband up. It's a bad day to skip church. You just got signed up. When he does this, his brother Frederick was also a pastor. His brother pastored in New York City. His brother is indignant. Like it says, as a pastor, you have one job, like behind the pulpit, talk about Jesus. You don't get involved in these other affairs. And so part of the letter he wrote his brother, he said, you would have acted for the best if you had kept out of this business from the beginning. I now give you my thoughts in brief. I think you were wrong. Well, John Peter writes his brother, who is a pastor, back and says, look, I hear everything you're saying, but let me just point out a few more things. He says, I'm a clergyman, it's true, but I'm a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberties as dear to me as any man. Shall I then sit still? Heaven forbid it. I'm convinced it is my duty to do so, and duty I owe to God and my country. He acknowledged, right? We have a dual responsibility. We have a heavenly home, but while we are here, we are going to steward what God has given us in the responsibility of this earth. Well, Frederick writes him back and says, no, look, you have problems because you have hotheads like Patrick Henry in New York. We don't have problems with the British. The reality was the British just hadn't made it to New York City yet. That was the beginning of 1776. Well, by the summer of 76, they got to New York. And actually, by the following summer, they were so frustrated with the leadership of pastors and the church. There were 19 churches in New York City, and they decided there should be no more churches in New York City. They burned 10 of them to the ground, and they destroyed the other 9. Frederick watched as they set fire to his church. And in that moment, he had an epiphany. He said, I think I need to get involved. He moved his family to Pennsylvania. He decides to get involved. By the way, when he moves to Pennsylvania, one of the things that happened because of the Declaration, all the founding fathers, when we separate from Great Britain, they now have to go back to their states and they have to write their own constitutions. It's fascinating if you look back to see who wrote the state constitutions. In many states, you will discover that it was pastors who took active roles in helping to write the government documents of the colonies of the states. To go further, when the revolution is over, and now it's time for the Constitution, the founding fathers meet and they write the Constitution September 17th, 1787. They send it back to the states to be ratified. Where does this get ratified? Well, let me point out, first of all, in many states, the ratification locations were churches. Why? Because they were the most prominent meeting locations of the community. They were the meeting houses. By the way, the people that helped ratify the Constitution in many locations, it was pastors helping ratify the Constitution. And when we finally have the Constitution ratified and the first Congress comes together, the first Congress are the ones that do the Bill of Rights. Well, the Bill of Rights has only 2 signatures on it. Go to Washington, D.C., National Archives, you can see it. Only 2 signatures. The 2 signatures are, number 1, John Adams, who was the vice president, but number 2, it's a Speaker of the House, a guy named Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. The guy who didn't want to get involved, had his church burned to the ground, has an awakening moment. He moved to Pennsylvania. He ran for office in Pennsylvania, became a member of the state assembly. He was a Speaker of the House in Pennsylvania before the Constitution. He then gets elected to the first Congress, and when he's in the first Congress and they're like, hey, has anybody ever been Speaker before? He's like, oh, I have. And they're like, great, we want you to be Speaker. I want to point out, and I tell Mike Johnson this all the time, Mike Johnson is one of the most godly Christian conservative leaders we have ever had in the history of our nation as Speaker of the House, with the possible exception of Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, right? But this is the reason it matters. Because if you look at everything that our nation became, we couldn't, oh, by the way, he was joined by his brother in the first Congress and many other pastors also in the first Congress. Everything that we accomplished and became to birth and become a nation, had it not been for the role and influence of the church, we never would have gotten there. And what I would say is where we are today, we couldn't have become a nation without the church. I'm not sure we can remain a nation without the church. And we have to change our thinking in a lot of ways. By the way, if you want to see more of this, I encourage you, fact check me on this, but we have a website, wallbuilders.com. We have lots of different resources. We have a brand new book that my dad and I wrote on the signers of the Declaration. Let me give you a closing challenge from John Adams. John Adams, in the middle of the revolution, while he was an ambassador over in Europe, he wrote Abigail, and they wrote all the time. And he was often very dramatic, and this was a dramatic letter. He says, Abigail, I don't think anybody appreciates the sacrifice I'm making. It's a little whiny, but maybe true. He said, nobody really appreciates, and he said, if I could get like our kids, if I could get all the kids together, there's something I would want to tell them. And this is what he wrote in the conclusion he wanted to tell everybody. Posterity, you will never know how much it costs a present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. We are living in an era where I don't think we fully appreciate the price that was paid for us to be where we are. But if we don't start making good use of it and actively engage, by the way, the name Wall Builders, this idea of rebuilding the wall, part of our goal and mission at Wall Builders is we want to partner with, strengthen, and encourage courageous leaders who will preserve freedom in America. Go back and rebuild that wall, the biblical foundation. And so this is where the challenge I want to give you, and I'm going to get out of the way, comes from Nehemiah. In Nehemiah 2:17, where he says, "Come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be disgraced." Everything that we see happening in America, we're like, that's disgraceful, right? It's happening because of a lack of influence and leadership from Christians, from the church. What this nation needs, by the way, in the midst of God on the move right now, there's a revival happening in this nation, contrary to what you might know or see. There's a move of God happening in this nation. I want to encourage you, you need to be far more active in taking part in what's going on. This is the call from Nehemiah. Guys, we can't sit on the sidelines. Come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be a disgrace. God bless you guys.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. My hope is that something in this conversation encouraged you, challenged you, or just helped you to see things just a little more clearly. If it did, I'd love for you to share this with someone who needs it, or just subscribe so we can keep having these conversations together. Keep standing firm, keep walking in faith, and remember, you are made to be courageous.